بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين، وسبحان الله العلي العظيم، ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله خاتم الأنبياء والرسل أجمعين، المرسل رحمة للعالمين، الصادق الأمين. ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على آله الميامين وعلى أصحابه الطيبين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. سبحان الله، نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونسترضيه ونستجيره ونستنصره، فإنه حقا من هدى الله فلا مضل له، ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. وندعو ونتضرع ونقول: يا رب، اقسم لنا من خشيتك ما يحول بيننا وبين معاصيك، واقسم لنا من رحمتك ما يقربنا من طاعتك. يا رب، نسألك من اليقين ما يهون علينا مصائب الدنيا وأحداثها. The Supreme Court of the United States is obviously one of the most influential institutions in this country, if not in the entire world. And each year, the Supreme Court hears arguments in a select number of cases. Eventually, it decides upon the cases it's selected to hear and issues an opinion. And the opinions that the Supreme Court gives influences and affects the way that all people who live in the United States get to live their lives. The Supreme Court is the third branch of government in the US, yields a considerable amount of influence in defining the values, the norms, the institutions, the way of life in the US, and in turn, because the US is not just politically and militarily influential, but also culturally influential, the Supreme Court in turn influences so much of what happens around the globe, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Well, this term, the Supreme Court is deciding a number of cases involving Muslims and issues that should be of considerable importance to Muslims, because what it decides will count as a precedent. And a precedent doesn't stay on for just one presidential term. It will stay on for the foreseeable future. Basically, any administration that will come in will count on these precedents, and the precedents become a life of their own in a variety of ways. The cases, and I will make sure that I don't get too technical, but basically, the two most prominent cases before the Supreme Court and cases that the Supreme Court just recently heard oral arguments about. So we just wait for the decisions. What is common to both cases is that both cases involve the claim by the federal government, by the executive branch of the federal government, that because of national security concerns and because of state secrets, the government maintains in both cases that the cases should be dismissed in summary fashion. One of those cases arose out of a prolonged detention in Guantanamo of a detainee that was grabbed from Afghanistan. His name is Abu Zubaydah. The United States, like in all of these detention cases, grabs someone, alleges that they have ties to either Al-Qaeda or Taliban. Few Muslims know, unfortunately, that President Bush took the decision early on that the US will not treat the Taliban under the Geneva Conventions, meaning although the US was invading Afghanistan, the president took the decision, made the decision, that although we were invading a foreign country, that native Afghani fighters belonging to the Taliban or any other Afghani force for that matter are not going to be treated under the rules of war regulated by the Geneva Conventions. What that practically meant is that you don't have to treat the Taliban or any other Afghanis as prisoners of war. But not only that, but you get to treat those who resist the American invasion of Afghanistan as exactly like you would treat Qaeda fighters. So basically, you get to treat them as terrorists. And as a result, the government, the US government, for many years now, all it has to do is claim that it is acting against a Muslim under the rubric of the war on terror, and the government gets superpowers if it makes such a claim. If the US government says, I am targeting a Muslim under the war of terror, the federal government, the executive branch, pretty much has nearly unfettered discretion in what it gets to do. It can grab any Muslim around the world that it claims has ties to Qaeda or Taliban or to Daesh or ISIS. It can grab any Muslim and it can throw them in a black site anywhere around the world. And it doesn't have to give them an opportunity to defend themselves. It doesn't have to afford them any type of defense. It doesn't have to afford them any type of explanation. It doesn't have to afford them any type of due process or hearing. It doesn't even have to admit that it is holding them. But in a very famous case decided by the Supreme Court years ago, the Supreme Court said that such a person grabbed under the label of the war on terror can even be an American citizen, can be a Muslim who is a US citizen, who is grabbed and considered an enemy of the United States. There is the qualifier that they have to be grabbed outside the US, not inside the US. But even a US citizen can be grabbed outside the US, thrown in a black site, held in Guantanamo, and can be held indefinitely as long as the government says we need to hold this person because of the war on terror. And the government does not need to charge this person, does not even need to present evidence, does not need even to provide an explanation. Many cases arose involving Muslims who were grabbed from all over the world. And there is a pattern to these cases. Case after case, a Muslim is grabbed, transferred to either a military base, usually Bagram in Afghanistan. At one point early on, there were also, some of them were transferred to a prison in Iraq or a black site anywhere around the world where they are tortured, and eventually after being tortured they are transferred to Guantanamo where their torture and torment continues and where they are held until the executive decides to release them, if the executive decides to release them. There is also a pattern as to these cases. None of these people were provided an explanation. None of these people were afforded due process. None of these people were made whole, although their lives were thoroughly destroyed. Abuses of power. Abuses of power are possible when the silence of people is complicit. And the problem with those Muslims, and with all the Muslim abuse cases, is that Muslims have been complicit with their silence. Like the Muslims of India like the Rohingyas, like the Uyghur Muslims, like the Muslims who are rotting in prisons all over the world, the Muslims of Guantanamo and the Muslims, the victims of the war on terror, found nothing but Muslim complicity through their Muslim silence. And because there is silence, the abuse continues. The nature of power is that it is intoxicating. And such an intoxicant knows no restraint unless the restraint is coercive. And violence only increases the intoxication of this power. Nothing serves the truly powerful except the excuse to level greater use of power and a greater demonstration of dominance and hegemony and supremacy. And so when you commit violence against the truly powerful, you only give them an excuse to unleash a greater intoxication of power. The only restraint that is possible is either public shaming, which sometimes works, solid democratic institutions, or the rule of law. So the cases before the Supreme Court, one of them involved this fellow called Abu Zubaydah, who the government, the US government says is a very important Qaeda operative. Is this true? Untrue? Allahu A'lam. Because the government gets to cherry pick what it presents or what it shares. None of us will get to hear Abu Zubaydah directly. But for the past 15 years, Abu Zubaydah has been held in Guantanamo without charges, without judicial process. And the only thing we know about this man is what the US government has decided to tell us. Of course, he's not alone. Right now, Guantanamo has about 40 Muslims and hundreds of other Muslims that were held for many years and released. Their lives are in shambles. But during the course of Abu Zubaydah's detainment, first, upon his arrest, he was held in a number of places. Among them, he was transferred to a black site in Poland. And in that black site in Poland, like unfortunately many other reports that reached us about black sites in Poland and Macedonia and Ukraine, he was tortured to the point that he lost an eye. And eventually, after being tortured in the black site in Poland, he is transferred to Guantanamo, where he remains. Abu Zubaydah found lawyers that were outraged by what happened. And of course, they're not Muslim lawyers. And having despaired of obtaining justice in the United States, they sued in the European Court of Human Rights, sued Poland, alleging that Poland violated the human rights of Abu Zubaydah when it allowed him to be held in a black site and tortured. The European Court of Human Rights demanded the presence of 2 American contractors, not American government officials, but American contractors who reportedly were hired by the CIA to torture Abu Zubaydah. And the US has an agreement with the European Union that allows the European Union to obtain the cooperation of the US in issuing a subpoena to US citizens to testify in cases, in certain types of cases in Europe. So the European Court of Human Rights demanded that these 2 US contractors testify in the case against Poland for torturing Abu Zubaydah. And the US moved to quash that subpoena on the grounds that if these 2 contractors testify, this will endanger the national security of the United States. This is known as the state secrets doctrine, where the government says to the court, if you allow this case to proceed, this will reveal information that will endanger the national security of the United States. So although these are not government officials, they're 2 contractors, but they shouldn't be allowed. And the US should not honor the European Court of Human Rights request to have these 2 people testify. And of course, if they don't testify, then the case filed against Poland is greatly affected. The second case has a very different posture. I mentioned some of the underlying facts of this case in another khutbah. But the FBI, in this case, hired an informant. His name is Montelier or something like that. This informant, it's sent to the Orange County area to pretend to be someone of French-Algerian origins who is interested in rediscovering his Islam and converting to Islam. And the FBI's instructions was to mingle in the community, to get to know as many people as possible, to photograph and record people, which the man did for a period of time, as I mentioned in the past khutbah, being paid very handsomely for his efforts. In fact, grotesquely well paid. And the man would go every day and pretty much got to know everyone in a number of mosques, but his focus was on a particular mosque in the Orange County area. And during this time, he would regularly meet with his FBI operatives. He would single out especially young people. He even asked permission of the FBI to have sex with some women in the Muslim community, and the FBI granted him permission to do so. And the FBI would show him pictures of people in the Muslim community in Orange County and ask him to rank them in order of danger. Who knows what the criteria for danger were? But any Muslim that spoke, that frequented the mosque, that taught, that did anything, was someone that he would target, and he would record, and he would film. Eventually, this man went around the Orange County area saying that his faith as a Muslim called upon him to wage jihad, and that he wants to commit a terrorist act, and he wants to kill some non-Muslims. And eventually, the imam of the mosques asked this man to stop coming to the mosque. And when he refuses to comply, he obtains a restraining order against him and calls the FBI and say, we have a potential terrorist in our midst. Of course, the imam had no clue that this is an actual FBI informant. And at that point, the FBI fired him. This reminds me of years ago when a journalist from the LA Times, named is Teresa Watanabe, called me and asked to meet with me urgently. And she came to our home and handed me over a long document of testimony by this man, by this informant, given to the LA Times. And Teresa's question was, is this man legit? When I read the document, it included the names of so many people that I know in the Muslim community, especially in Orange County. It even included the names of some people that I had as students in the law school. And this man's story was shocking simply because it was an affirmation of what so many Muslims suspected. The FBI was not just spying on Islamic institutions. The FBI was sending informants, planting the idea of criminal activity, and basically anyone that would fall in the dragnet by expressing a desire to engage in criminal activity would be trapped, because they in turn would be turned into informants, if not criminally prosecuted. So the lawsuit is by the Imam Fazaga in Orange County and a few others that sued the FBI for illegal spying and for discrimination against them as Muslims, because their freedom to practice their religion was greatly impacted They were terrorized and intimidated by the government. So many of the people who had an experience with this informant don't feel safe any longer in going to the mosque or teaching or being active members of the community. And they said that this is discrimination against our religion and our freedom to practice our religion. We were targeted for nothing else other than the fact that we are Muslim. And the government's defense was in part to claim immunity, that part is technical and there's no need to get into it. But the other part, that's like the first case, the government said, well, this case should be dismissed because if we defend ourselves in this case, it will involve revealing secret evidence. It will involve revealing state secrets and doing so would endanger national security. The trial court, the district court, accepted what the government had said and dismissed the case without even asking the government, well, what type of evidence are you talking about that's so dangerous that the entire case has to be thrown out just because you say that national security will be compromised if this lawsuit continues to go on. The circuit court reversed the district court not by saying the lawsuit should go on or by saying that Muslims should win. All the circuit court said is that the district court was too hasty in throwing out the case without first finding out a little bit about the alleged secret evidence that the government is saying is so dangerous that it would compromise national security. So really, what the circuit court said is that the judge should have asked the government to summarize this very dangerous evidence that would be revealed if the case is not dismissed, and should do so ex parte, meaning in secret. So the defense doesn't even get to know what the evidence is. And then the judge, after looking at the summary, should decide whether to dismiss the case or not. And that's the decision that the Supreme Court is reviewing. Well, several things actually caught my attention about these cases. The Ninth Circuit decision is very long and very complicated. In the Fasaga case, the number of attorney hours that went into this case is truly enormous. The case was brought on behalf of Muslims by the ACLU. I can tell you that if this case wasn't handled by the ACLU, if this case was being handled by a private attorney, it would have costed no less than $1 million. And ultimately, all this cost is just so the district court will actually hold the government a little bit more accountable before saying, I'm dismissing this case because for national security reasons. The Supreme Court that's hearing the case is the Supreme Court that has had, this is the same Supreme Court that upheld the Muslim ban. A Supreme Court that is remarkably deaf when it comes to cases of prejudice against Muslims. This is the same Supreme Court that said that the government can hold a Muslim citizen indefinitely as long as the government says there is a war on terror. This is the same Supreme Court that opened the door, opened the path, or allowed for all types of abuses to proceed against Muslims because Muslims are not part of the public conscience of the US. I'm not optimistic about the result in either case. But even if there is a victory, even if there is a victory, consider this. This case was exposed because of a very unusual situation. The informant in question broke ranks when the FBI unceremoniously fired him. And although he had a non-disclosure agreement with the government, per this agreement, he would go to prison if he ever talked about this case. This particular informant took the very unusual step of saying, I don't care if I go to prison, I'm blowing the whistle on this matter. For every case that reaches the court, for every individual tortured in a black site that actually sues, and the case actually goes up the appellate process, can you imagine how many individuals were never heard of? We have no clue about. In the same way, this is a case was exposed because of an informant that said, I don't care if I go to prison. Can you imagine how many cases of FBI spying on Muslims, entrapping Muslims, building unlawful records and surveillance of Muslims? But even the cases that are exposed, if there was no ACLU and no civil rights organizations, it is not even conceivable that any Muslim would have been able to fund a lawsuit like this at their own expense. But even when we get a lawsuit, judges, the judiciary is made up of human beings. Human beings are influenced by culture. that are influenced by systems of knowledge. And judges, particularly the legal profession, tends to be a conservative, and particularly the judiciary tends to be not just conservative, even liberal judges, but rather meek and shy institution. No judge wants to risk being told, if a terrorist attack happens, that you were responsible for what happened, because you, although you're an unelected official, you're the one who let the terrorists go free. So what judges do, and this is typical, is that unless their consciousness, unless their antenna, their sensitivities are heightened, unless the political cost of allowing a government to get away with abuses is high, judges will err on the side of believing the government. If the government tells them this Muslim is dangerous, okay. But if the government comes and tells them this Jew is dangerous, a judge is sufficiently acculturated, sufficiently has their sensitivities rallied up to say, wait, what are you saying? Same thing with cases involving white supremacist groups. Judges have enough of a political capital to be able to tell the government, wait, you're telling me that you violated the right of this white person and you have national security reasons that you can't even talk about? Why not? But when it comes to Muslims, because Muslims are such a silent victim, complicit in their own misery through their own silence and ignorance, courts don't invest a lot of time in the social implications of the case in which they handle. If you're telling me this is a dangerous Muslim, this is a jihadi Muslim, they should be held in a black site and tortured, okay, I'll go along. And no one is embarrassing me when I say I'm going to go along. As a judge, it's not costing me anything when I say I'm going to go along. So I just say, okay, I'm going to demur. I'm going to defer. If you're telling me this is a jihadi Muslim and they need to be held in Guantanamo for 10, 15, 20, 30 years without charges, okay, I'll go along. After all, I look around and everyone seems to hate Muslims, and no one is embarrassing me for demurring, for deferring, so I just go along. It's after all, it's not me. If you're telling me Muslims are dangerous and must be banned, well, I'll go along. After all, there's some even Muslims who say that's a good idea. So, it's not like anti-Semitism. It's not like Black Lives Matter. It's not like issues that are racially explosive. This is non-explosive issues. A bad Muslim. And who gets to decide who's a bad Muslim? Well, the judiciary shouldn't decide. It should be the executive. If you're telling me Muslims need to be spied on, and you're telling me that Muslims need to be entrapped in terrorist plots and sent to prison forever, okay, I'll trust your judgment. I'll go along. After all, Muslims themselves are not bothered if they're spied on. It's not like spying on a synagogue. It's not like spying on any actually conscious, civilly conscious people who will raise hell. Muslims can't even fund their own lawsuits. Muslims are so oblivious that they don't even have institutions that can protect them legally or that actually litigate their own cases. Muslims are all completely reliant on the non-Muslim other as they sit there pontificate about Sunnah and Hadith, and whether this insignificant point or that insignificant point. Judges are human beings. The judiciary is a human institution. And so is even the executive. The FBI that grabbed Muslims from all around the world, the CIA that grabbed Muslims from all around the world, tortured them, knew there's no blowback. No Muslim government is going to say, how dare you? And the FBI that spied and entrapped Muslims. There was even a minor caveat that caught my attention about the story of the informant. Every Muslim that trusted this informant and told them something about themselves that turned out to be illegal paid the price. So there is one guy that actually one guy that befriended this informant. Of course, he didn't know he was an informant. And when the informant started talking about blowing up stuff, this guy called up the FBI and turned in his friend, turned in the informant, and was surprised when after he had called the FBI, he saw nothing happen to this guy. But during the course of this friendship, he told the informant that he had lied on his citizenship application years earlier. So although this was a good citizen in the sense that he turned in someone he thought was a terrorist, after the informant was fired, after this lawsuit was filed, this guy found himself arrested and found himself in denaturalization proceedings because he had lied on his citizenship application. So, for being a good citizen, turning in someone he thought was a terrorist, he was arrested, his citizenship taken away, and he's deported to Egypt. And of course, Muslims are too busy yapping on about absolutely nothing on social media, engaging in pretensions of importance, as the world rolls on. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه يا رب. It is not only that our priorities are off. It is not only that our consciousness as Muslims is deeply affected and deconstructed. It wouldn't at all surprise me, at all, if you find the Muslims of today in the same way that so many Muslims said, oh, Trump is not really an Islamophobe, he's just a politician. Can you imagine, try to imagine this said about anyone else? So if I come and I say a bunch of things that is grotesquely anti-Jewish, can you ever imagine a self-respecting Jew would come and say, Khaled is not really an anti-Semite, he's just pretending to be, so for political reasons? What would you imagine the position of this Jew in his own community would be? Imagine if I come and I use the N-word and say horrible things about blacks. And then someone would come and say, Khaled is not really a racist. He's just pretending to be, so he can get elected. You would look at this person and say, you're disgusting. If you act like a racist, you're a racist. But with Muslims, I've heard this a million times. Oh yeah, you're just saying horrible things about Islam for political reasons, but doesn't mean anything. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Muslims who would say, oh, well, you know, the FBI is spying on Muslims, so what? Oh, well, you know, those people that were grabbed, Muslims were grabbed around the world and tortured, well, you know, they could be tortured in their own country. Well, how about if they were born, as many of them were, born in the US? Oh, well, you know, it's just, these are aberrations. That's how a defeated people think. That's precisely how a broken people think. But it is not just about defeatism. It is not just about defeatism. One of the students showed me an article that is very interesting for just the tip of the iceberg it reveals. The article talks about how the Emirates, the United Arab Emirates, invested an enormous amount of money incubating and supporting Islamophobic organizations in Sweden. But a little bit of research as to articles that this article references and others, it becomes quite obvious that the United Arab Emirates incubated information networks consisting of right-wing nationalists, Islamophobes, and Orientalists in the academia, in the media, and in policy-making institutions. And not just in the US, not just in Europe, but even in countries like the Cameroon and other African countries. The UAE spent millions of dollars on civil rights organizations in Europe, like the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, to make these organizations, who are supposed to be focused on civil rights, focus on Islamophobic discourse. In other words, convince Europe and the US of the danger of Islamists. The UAE funded a Center for Asymmetric Threat and Terrorism Studies, which is headed by a notorious man called Magnus Ranstorp. Magnus Ranstorp is identical, like, to Robert Spencer and Daniel Pipes in the amount of anti-Islamic garbage he spews out. The logic of the UAE is bizarrely simple. The institutions funded, the Islamic institutions and academic Islamophobic institutions funded by the United Arab Emirates, started pushing something called the conveyor belt theory. And the conveyor belt theory is identical to Daniel Pipes and Robert Spencer's sleeper cell theory. What it says is that Islamism, which according to the UAE-funded organizations, is any Islamic institution that is interested in any civil rights issue or international issue or any political issue. So all these organizations, all these institutions, all these Muslim intellectuals, including any Muslim who writes or teaches or speaks about Sharia, is, according to the conveyor belt theory, acts like an entryway drug. All Islamic institutions are entryway drugs to jihadism. You start out interested in the Quran and in the Sunnah. You start out interested in prayer and fasting, and before you know it, you are on the conveyor belt to becoming a jihadi. So the solution, with remarkable regularity, for every institution funded by the UAE, whether it is in the Cameroon or the US, in DC or Paris or Sweden or Oslo, Norway, the solution is that you have to control what occurs in Islamic centers. You have to control all Muslim civic society organizations. You have to carefully navigate and engineer the way Muslims think, the way Muslims talk, the way Muslims teach, and the way Muslims learn. Now, all of this is done in the name of Western values of freedom, democracy, and, believe it or not, religious liberty. And the UAE spends millions of dollars disseminating this message in the name of religious tolerance. The way Muslims teach, speak, think, talk. In other words, there's a word for this, and the word is colonialism. Colonize the Muslim mind. What is the UAE's incentive? As amazing as this sounds, Mohammed bin Zayed, after the Arab Spring, became convinced there is one real threat to his despotic and authoritarian system of governance in the United Arab Emirates. Mohammed bin Zayed believes that if there is ever a popular threat against the legitimacy of his government and the way that he unilaterally controls the untold wealth of the United Arab Emirates and without oversight gets to spend whatever he wants of his country's wealth, if there's any danger, it will come from a Muslim and Islamically animated people. If there's any danger, it's secularism is not going to get these Muslims animated. Communism is not going to do it. Socialism is not going to do it. It is only one real threat. An Islam that cares about human rights, human dignity, and democracy. And so his response is to disseminate an Islam around the world that is thoroughly controlled and regulated. I go back with what I started with. The pretense is that you as a Muslim, the pretense is that you are discovering things about your religion that are making you doubt. The pretense is that Muslims are plagued by this or Muslims are plagued by that. But in reality, there are holders of power that manipulate and engineer everything that you know about your own tradition and even your attitude towards Muslims defending themselves against oppression. If the ACLU stands up to defend Muslims because their civil rights have been violated, it's one thing. But if CARE does it, then according to the UAE and UAE-funded organizations, CARE is a terrorist organization. And so the average Muslim, in light of this Islam that is pushed and propagated everywhere you turn by the United Arab Emirates, learns to steer away from trouble, not to build institutions that can leverage power in the favor of Muslims, in Muslims' favor, not to engage civil society in a serious constructive way, but to simply do what courts do, and that's to defer and to demur. Even courts are influenced by the United Arab Islam, because courts don't have the time and don't have the expertise to develop counter narratives to the narratives they hear from power. And if people in DC and Sweden and Oslo and all the people that have the titles are telling them Islam is dangerous, and then the government comes and says, I have to do what I did because these are dangerous people. I can't tell you why they're dangerous, but just trust me. And that's exactly what courts do, and have done, and will do. They'll say to the government, okay, we'll trust you. Go ahead. Abuse these people because we don't know better. It has become a moral obligation for every Muslim to divorce any Islam, to divorce any Muslim institution, to divorce any Muslim individual that is complicit in accepting Emirati money, and complicit in accepting and being part of the extremely insidious program that the Emirat has spread around the world. Whatever its Emirat intentions are. Just this week, the Emirat held again with Bahrain military exercises with Israel. Last year, the Emirat hosted a conference in which representatives from all religions signed an agreement where all the religions agreed to defend each other against prejudice. The remarkable thing is that the Emirat, who hosted and sponsored and funded this conference, of course, where yours, Hamza Yusuf and Bin Bayya were the Muslim representatives, it doesn't apparently include the expectation of either Muslims, Christians, or Jews defending Muslims when they are persecuted in India, or where they are persecuted in China, or where they are persecuted in Palestine. Although by the terms of this agreement, it would seem to be that's what tolerance is. But according to the Emirat, no. Muslims should defend Christians and Jews if they're persecuted, but it doesn't work the other way. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. أسأل الله يستجب لكم. إني داع فأمنوا. اللهم اعف عنا. اللهم اغفر لنا. اللهم ارحمنا. اللهم اهدنا سواء السبيل والصراط المستقيم يا رب العالمين. Allah, forgive our sins. Grant us the guidance to follow your path. Grant us the strength to stand for truth. And aid us, so that we can perform our obligations towards you and towards this faith. Ya Allah, Ya Ali, Ya Azim, wa salli wa sallim wa barik ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ya Rabb.